So in my presentation this afternoon, basically what I want to do is echo my book. I want to make three key points. The first is that there are a number of cognitive, operational biases that have been observed by myself and others over the years in foreign aid, which are increasingly at odds with the world that we live and work in, but continue to exert an undue influence over what we do, how we do it, why we do it, and how we report on it. The second point I want to make is that many of the problems that we face today in development and humanitarian work can be understood rather better using tools from complex adaptive systems research. There are methods, there are tools, there are approaches, and above all there are mindsets, all of which can be utilised by development agencies to make their work much more relevant and appropriate. And that's the third point that I want to make, that actually aid can work differently if it was to take consideration of these approaches, and there's increasing evidence of the relevance of these approaches for helping to understand the world better and helping to inform policy and practice that's much more attuned to the world as it actually is, rather than the world as we would like it to be. Let me begin with an illustration of what I mean. And it's an account of an enduring myth in the annals of aid history. It's the eradication of smallpox. And as many of you all know, it's one of only two diseases to be eradicated in human history, the other being rinderpest. And I think what's interesting is that the way that smallpox was eradicated is not widely talked about or understood in the sector as a whole. The main WHO website makes reference to a global mass vaccination campaign led by that entity. And the campaign's typically described in a very top-down fashion. It involves the rollout of simple, standardised processes in nice, well-oiled mechanical fashion, moving from one country to another very smoothly, hitting a magic number, which was 80%, which was the rate that they needed to reach in developed countries in order to eradicate smallpox. And what's actually interesting is that mass vaccination was not the only or even the most important aspect of the strategy that led to eradication. The most detailed historical first-hand accounts that we have point to a rather different story, which is only really partially acknowledged in the official histories. These alternative accounts suggest that, contrary to popular belief, there were innovative and experimental approaches around surveillance and containment that were far more important and helped break the transmission chain of smallpox, even in those countries where the vaccination rates remained less than 50%. And so the successful strategy, which is typically presented as a success of top-down planning, a highly visible approach of applying vaccination, was in fact a process of emergent, adaptive, networked experimentation and learning. And each country had to develop very context-specific approaches, their own, and even those involved didn't plan for or envision what the relevant approach would be at the outset. The campaign had to adapt and learn and adjust to context. Don Henderson, who's the much-lauded director of the campaign, talked about the need for the effort to evolve over time and develop different approaches and strategies. This is what he said formally. Informally, he was famously said the only way he made it work was to break every rule in the WHO book. So I think there's an interesting point here that this learning process, more than any other factor, has been described as the single most important element of the success of the campaign. And the Director General of the WHO in 1980, when he made the announcement that smallpox had been eradicated, said it was a triumph of management, not of medicine. And apart from it being very interesting for the director of that entity to say about that entity's preeminent achievement, arguably, I think this comment also highlights a rather stark fact that the official aid histories, even development management literature, doesn't really say very much about the nature of that managerial success. Now, you might be asking yourself why I'm telling you this story. What I would say is that this illustrates something that's very widespread in aid. That aid institutions strongly incentivize the use of certain kinds of language, certain mindsets, certain assumptions, certain approaches to describe what we did in aid, how we do it, why we did it, and that this gets used to describe successes. It gets applied to failures, often in the face of all of the available evidence. And I think the reason for this is that really to be found in development and humanitarian aid institutions. We spend a lot of time in development research and in development agencies generally talking about the need for good institutions. And very seldom do we ever turn that lens on our own ways of working. And those people that have looked at aid institutions, Ellen Ostrom amongst them, there are others as well, talk about the fact that development aid institutions are anchored in certain mental and cognitive models. And in my own investigations in the book, I've looked at how aid agencies strategize, how they learn, how they organize themselves, how they report on their performance, and how they assess their own performance. And essentially, what I've found is that there's an evidence for a certain set of biases that we seem to think and act in effect as if the economy, the world around us, natural resource systems, communities, society as a whole are analogous to a gigantic clockwork, some kind of Newtonian, kind of simple Newtonian mechanism. And essentially we can predict and precisely control these systems through analysis and through breaking these problems down into ever smaller parts, ever neater, manageable pieces, and working on these pieces individually. Almost as if we're kind of pulling developing countries into our repair shed and working on the bits that we're most interested in whilst keeping everything else constant. And so the role of aid managers and leaders in this setup is to engineer and construct change through reductionist analysis, through prediction, through planning, through standardization. Now, these assumptions underpin large amounts of what the formal aid system tries to do, whether it's community development efforts or statewide reconstruction efforts or governance processes or indeed global health campaigns. Now, there are a number of implicit assumptions that amount to these biases. And let me just take you through these quickly. There are assumptions about systems, that these systems that we work in are closed, ordered, they're reducible to the parts that we're most interested in, whilst everything else is held constant, and they're nothing more than the sum of their parts. About relationships, that we can deal with individuals, institutions, entities, effectively as if they were independent and atomized, that their most important characteristics are to be found at the individual level, and the contexts and relationships between them are ahistorical or can be entirely rewritten by external actors, i.e. aid agencies. About behaviours, that humans make behaviours based on perfect rationality and self-interest, and that this behaviour can be specified in top-down ways by merely changing the inputs into this elaborate calculus that we all supposedly use. And finally about change, that change is linear, additive, with a simple cause and effect, where you've got a proportionality between inputs, outputs and outcomes, so that more input should always lead to more outcomes. It's a world of nice straight lines and lovely XY relationships. Now, these ideas have their origins in 19th century physical sciences, and they found their way into organizations and institutions through scientific management of late 19th and early 20th century business, through the ideal bureaucracies of the same period, and through neoclassical economics. So this is what Henry Ford used in order to provide any colour car as long as it was black. And so, perhaps unsurprisingly, they are most useful. These principles work brilliantly in situations where machines work well, where there's a stable operating environment, where there's a straightforward task to perform, where the context is predictable, where you can deliver identical duplicable products, and they're compliant, predictable, reliable parts, including the human components. Hands up anyone who feels their working environment resembles this picture. It may seem risible, but this is precisely how the smallpox campaign is imagined to have worked. And this is a story that's often told for many years and still told in some quarters. And the same kinds of assumptions underpin the famously failed 1960s Malaria Campaign. In 1968, 1969, there was a lot of work done on malaria eradication. The Pearson report in 1970, from which we still use the 0.7% figure that's held up as the target of GDP, that announced that we were within years of eradicating malaria completely. And what the statement in red here is the thing I want you to focus on. The Malaria Campaign mandated identical job descriptions in every country, prescribed specific charts to be displayed on the walls of every office at each administrative level. And it was essentially conceived as a military operation to be conducted in identical matter, whatever the battlefield. And what was particularly interesting was that research was considered unnecessary because they had all the knowledge, they knew the equations, they knew what was needed to be applied, and it was suspended from the start of the programme. The smallpox programme deliberately set out not to do this precisely because of the challenges they saw with this approach. But the same kinds of approaches, the same way of thinking, underpinned integrated rural development of the same era. They've continued to shape a lot of what you might be called big aid. So look at global education initiatives, as recently described and critiqued by Lamp Pritchett. Look at the low-cost package of inputs that Jeffrey Sachs promoted as being the way of addressing the Millennium Development Goals. Or look at the harsh reality of the Millennium Village project, as recently described by Nina Monk. This is an illusion that aid institutions, the aid counter-bureaucracy, as Andrew Natsios of USAID famously described it, that they demand this illusion be maintained in the face of the evidence. And what I've observed in the work that I've been doing across the sector is the frustrations with this model are running at fever pitch, whether you're a donor, NGO, UN, operational agency. A senior donor leader recently said to me, we don't actually want evidence, we don't really want results. What we want are simple solutions to simple problems so we can demonstrate value for money. And I think everyone, what is really interesting and what's really driving the frustration is in the face of the failures of this model, we seem to be applying it ever harder. We're trying to do the wrong thing righter. And everyone from senior leaders to external critics talk about the flawed business model of aid. And I would say this is in part, at least, what they are talking about. Now, I'm not saying that any individual believes these things. I'm not saying that if you went in and spoke to anyone in an aid agency, they'd say, well, it's, this is how we design and plan things. Or that any institution formally talks about these things. I think it's a subtler point that this way of thinking is hardwired into institutions, and so there's a need to, through the tools, techniques, the processes that we have, to behave in ways that act as if this is actually the way the world operates. And those tools and techniques that get most prevalence, that get scaled up most quickly or most effectively, take the logical framework, or more recently the randomized controlled trial. These are all tools that really reinforce this model of the world. People do work in remarkably creative and innovative ways in aid, but it's often despite institutions that they work in rather than because of them. And I think the smallpox case powerfully illustrates this, how pervasive this problem is when the real adaptive success is overwritten with a tale of mechanistic top-down procedures. And I think the reason this is so important is if we continue with our addiction to reductionism, then we risk learning the wrong lessons from our successes and not learning at all from our failures. So rather less portentously, this quip from Duncan Watts of Yahoo, the Newtonian model is staggering about the global stage like a mortally wounded Shakespearean actor. You could replace global with development, and I think you'd have a pretty good description of the challenges that we face. I think it's worth asking, given that every generation of aid critiques, all the way back to the 1960s, Albert Hirschman wrote about the problems with aid development as a planning in the 1960s, Robert Chambers in the 1970s and 80s, Bill Easterly in the 2000s. Why does this problem keep coming back? Why does this wounded monarch refuse to die? I would say in part it's because there's a number of development problems, arguably a diminishing number, which are amenable to exactly this kind of model, exactly this kind of approach. But to paraphrase Keynes, I think perhaps a more cynical, or more realistic answer is that it may well be better for individual and institutional reputation to fail conventionally within the confines of this model than to succeed unconventionally by moving beyond it. So let me move on now to the second part of my argument. The obvious reality is that development and humanitarian problems and the world at large are not like Newtonian clockworks, they're not like Ford motor cars. Growing numbers of experts have been pointing to the ideas of complex adaptive systems as an alternative way of thinking about a whole host of problems, from welfare policy to healthcare issues, and indeed in international development. And this is what I explore in the second part of my book. Now, in order to introduce these ideas to you, what I want to do is essentially give you a little bit of the history, because I think it really helps understand why these ideas are important, where they've come from. The seeds of this complexity movement, many people will talk about the new complexity science or the new movement towards complexity. Actually, the seeds were sown 60 years ago by a man called Warren Weaver, and he was the science vice president of the Rockefeller Foundation. And to my eyes, he was a forgotten giant of 20th century scientific research. He led research on microbiology, he funded the development of penicillin, he did all kinds of work on anti-aircraft measures. He was decorated by France, Canada, America and Britain during the war for his interventions. He personally mentored almost 20 Nobel laureates, or people that would go on to be Nobel laureates. He was also a very humble man, which is, I think, part of the reason he's been forgotten. But essentially, he found himself in a position not dissimilar to many modern donors or funders in whatever setting. He found himself thinking, 1948, at the end of the war, what kinds of problems should the Rockefeller Foundation, arguably one of the most important not-for-profits in the world at that time, what kind of things should they be funding? And as I explained in the book, he was a true polymath, so he was well placed to be able to address the question. And what he observed was a quite significant gap in what scientists and policymakers were trying to address. And he talked about three kinds of problems that he saw in the world around him, and that there'd been much more progress on addressing two of them than on the third. So the first kind of problem were problems of organised simplicity. These are problems of one or two variables where you can essentially boil it down to an equation that once you've got that equation, you can apply it ad infinitum and it will work every time for a given class of problems. So the trajectories of a rocket or Newtonian mechanics. It underpins many of the social advances we saw in the 19th century. So transportation, germ theory, many forms of basic health provision. If you run through the list of things that we've got from this way of thinking, it often makes me think of the Life of Brian quote, what did the Romans ever do for us? And I think there's quite an interesting, there are lots of situations where exactly these approaches are necessary. What Weaver then identified was at the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century, scientists and policymakers had leapt to the other extreme. And they started looking at systems that had many, many variables, all of which are interacting randomly. So the motion of atoms is a good scientific example, statistical mechanics in physics, actuarial studies of populations or population studies more generally, the kinds of things that insurance companies would apply to populations in order to determine risks and turn a profit. And what these tools tried to do is essentially, because you couldn't boil things down to one or two simple equations, they looked at entire populations and took statistical averages. And then they used these averages to inform the way that they made policy making and scientific advances. And what he identified in between the two were that what he saw as the class of problems that really were underpinning most of the challenges that human beings were facing, particularly in the 50 years to come. He was writing in 1948. And these are problems of what he described as organised complexity. These are problems related to a sizable number of factors, not one or two, and not an infinite number, but a sizable number. They're intricately interwoven into an organic whole, so you can't easily or usefully break them down to the one or two variables that really matter, nor can you apply statistical averages. And he listed the kinds of things this included, and it's actually quite illustrative. So commodity prices, economic development, the growth of cities, child development in education, mass social movements. A whole host of things in the social realm and economic realm fell into exactly this category. And what he argued was that it was far easier and therefore more convenient for scientists and policymakers to address problems of the first two kind. Because then you could boil things down and say, this is what we need to do, ergo we should do it. But what he also went on to argue was that almost all the major challenges that we would face in the 50 years to come would be of the third variety. And so that we needed a new advance, a third great advance, as he called it, in scientific thinking, which would combine multidisciplinary power. He'd been working during the war and he'd done all kinds of interesting experiments, bringing crystallographers together with anthropologists to talk about how they would deal with aircraft safety and things like that. So all kinds of different ways of multidisciplinary working. So he saw that as being one key way forward. The other approach was what he rather touchingly called advanced counting machines, essentially computers. And he thought investment in those two areas would be essential if we were going to be able to better understand and navigate these problems. So in part 2 of the book, I describe the progress on Warren Weaver's third great advance. I think as it applies to social, economic and political contexts in particular, I think what's interesting is that he's had a considerable influence across the intellectual spectrum. So at least two Nobels in economics, Herb Simon and Friedrich Hayek, cited him, were hugely influenced by him and cited him in their Nobel acceptance speeches. Jane Jacobs, who's definitively the most influential urban scholar of the 20th century, dedicated an entire chapter of her famous book, Death and Life of the American City, to exactly Warren Weaver's articulation of organised complexity. It was called What Kind of Problem a City Is. And that then subsequently contributed to a whole stream in social science and social planning around wicked problems. So I think what's also really interesting is it was a founding text of systems thinking. It also underpinned the development of the Santa Fe Institute, which is the leading institute for the study of complex systems in the US. And it was only 6 pages long, this article. So I think there's it may well have been the shortest piece ever to have inspired a new movement in scientific thinking. So what's interesting today is that we are seeing many arguments that the world is full of complex adaptive problems. They are complex in that they are made up of many interacting agents and organizations of agents. They're adaptive in that those agents design and strategies and they evolve over time. And they're systems in that you can't simply reduce them to one or two variables, but there are lots of macro patterns that emerge from the micro behavior. So ecological systems are complex, and the costs of dealing with them as simple machines are all around us. The climate is clearly complex and non-linear. The economy is complex at national and global level. Energy systems are complex. It used to be that people would point to North America to illustrate the complexity of energy systems, but actually you can look across Europe and indeed the UK. Food systems, information systems, communities, societies, organisations, all can be usefully analysed and understood as complex systems. And I think what's important to highlight, though, is that this is a vast area with many, many different tools, techniques and approaches, and it can be very confusing. And so what I tried to do was to speak to and work with people that specialise in this area and identify where these tools have been applied specifically in social, political and economic contexts. And what's interesting is, sorry, my deck's slightly. What's interesting is that essentially there are 4 broad areas that complex systems approaches enable us to address. The first is systems. It enables us to think of systems that can't be boiled down to one or two variables, so where you can take a wide-angle lens on the problems that we face. It enables us to think about, sorry, a very sensitive mouse. I think we can also understand through system dynamics the kinds of problems that we're dealing with, how they are shaped by interdependence and feedback. The other set of tools, or the second set of tools, is networks, to think about the relationships between individuals, between groups, between communities, to understand the underlying structure of social, economic and political relationships and how these change over time. We can think much more about behaviours as well, about how we really make decisions individually and collectively, and how those decision matrices are influenced by the incentives that we're operating within. And then finally about dynamics and patterns, which are non-linear. They're characterised by surprise and tipping points and phase transitions. It's not the straight line, kind of pretty XY relationships that I talked about earlier. And these are 4 broad families of approaches for analysing and better navigating complex phenomena. These 4 are the ones which I found are most relevant, and they're the ones where there's been most amount of effort. And they provide an interesting contrast to the operating assumptions of aid that I set out earlier. What I show in the book is that these methods, these tools, provide a comprehensive alternative to these approaches. So let me close by talking briefly about how these ideas can be applied to thinking about development differently and doing development differently. In the book, there's over 25 case studies across these 4 areas of systems, behaviours, networks, and dynamics, of aid agencies, development agencies, of researchers who tried new ways of thinking, new ways of working, and were able to actually achieve dramatically improved results. They're to be found in every subsector of aid, from education to health to conflict to natural resource management. Now, because of the time I've got available, I've just chosen one short case study from the area of network science to illustrate how complex systems approaches have been utilised in development research and how they're increasingly used in policies. And the area is specifically looking at economic growth. Now, all of us are dramatically affected by webs, networks, relationships, whether they're social, economic, or biological. These networks are invisible often, but they can have a profound influence on everything from our mental and physical health, our socioeconomic status, even our life expectancy. Studies which have shown in the UK, smoking prevalence, the most important reason why people stay smoking is because of social networks. Obesity has been identified as being underpinned by social networks. Organisationally too, many of us rely on networks in order to further our career, in order to understand, unpick our, and further our knowledge base. And let me just give you an illustration here. This is a network of executives in the exploration and production division of a large petroleum firm. And they were going through a restructuring process, so they essentially wanted to get rid of everyone one layer below the senior vice president, Jones, so everyone below Williams, Taylor and Stock. And the idea was actually it was based on profit maximizing processes, that they could outsource a number of these different functions. And what they actually identified was that there was a challenge to this from within the division, which said, well, actually, the formal organisational chart hides more than it reveals. And so they conducted a social network analysis of the people who these executives saw as being the most important conversations that they were having, which were most important for their day-to-day work, i.e. who were the people that they spoke to on a daily basis that were absolutely integral to the way in which they did the work. And then they mapped out the relationships, and it turns out that this relatively junior executive here was actually central to the effective functioning of the entire department. But the formal organisational chart wouldn't have revealed that. And for this reason, social network analysis has been referred to as an organisational X-ray. Now, this kind of analysis can be very useful in revealing patterns of connectivity in all kinds of different phenomena within organisations, patterns of productivity, of relationships between firms, the decisions around what kind of entities you might want to support or allow to collapse after a financial crisis can be analysed looking at how central entities are, and this is the kind of analysis that people say should have been done around the financial crisis. Gender equity, disease spread, there's a whole host of phenomena. In the last couple of years, I've led work on water sustainability in Ghana and Uganda, and on women and girls empowerment in Nigeria, which used exactly these techniques. So the potential applications are endless. But there is one specific application that's got a lot of attention. It's work done by Harvard and MIT, led by Ricardo Hausmann, who's the former CEO, chief economist of the Inter-American Development Bank, and Cesar Hidalgo, who's a network scientist. And they developed a network-based approach to analyse economic development. And their starting point was that a lot of standard development economic thinking doesn't engage very well with the idea of webs and networks. That the idea of relationships actually run counter to a lot of standard thinking. And what you get is lots of development economics where they try to analyse economic performance based on individual criteria, individual aspects, whether it's individuals within a family or within specific communities or indeed specific countries. And then they look at aggregate data related to those individuals and then try and use that to explain things. So the classic conundrum is, why did Ghana and Malaysia go in such different paths when they both came out of colonialism in the same year, 1957? They were both largely rural. They had about the same level of industrialization at that time, and they've gone in completely different directions. Why is that? And the conundrum is that actually a lot of standard development thinking doesn't have much to be able to have many answers to that particular problem. And so there's lots of puzzling over why, when we've got these aggregate qualities, those kinds of differences, that differential performance actually happens. What it turns out, what their hypothesis was that in that particular context, the networks of productive knowledge within a country condition and shape the development of that country. And it's the structure of the network that can best explain growth and stagnation. Let me give you an illustration. So essentially what they found, this is the product space of a given country, and it may look like a complete nightmare, but essentially it's color-coded, and there's a fantastic online tool called the Atlas of Economic Complexity, which I urge you to go online and play around with. It's got data for 128 countries over a 50-year period. And it's a whole range of different sectors, and this is a kind of idealized product space. Essentially, it's if you look at the relationship between any two products, probably to understand this, it's useful to know where it came from. So it was actually inspired by Ricardo's observations of the production and export of artichokes in Peru, and how this created almost all of the conditions necessary for the production and export of asparagus. So the soil, the climate, packing technologies, logistics, the skilled agronomists, various phytosanitation laws, trade agreements. All of that productive knowledge was on hand, and it could be readily redeployed to the new business. And so the idea is that if you write that large across all of the products within a particular economy, you get a picture of the national productivity network. And this is what they call the product space. And this network conditions and shapes the development of nations. And by using network analysis, we can get a sense of the opportunities for development based on the kinds of productivity that's already going on and the kinds of things which they might then do as a result. So if Peru, for example, instead of trying to move into asparagus, had tried to move into toasters, it wouldn't have been able to have any great success. Because obviously the capabilities they had for the export of vegetables would have been little or no use. And the analysis that they've done is actually highly numerical, and it's too detailed to really go into here, but what I want to give you is some of the visualizations, because the visualizations are very powerful. So essentially, Ghana and Malaysia, both largely rural, poor countries with very similar GDPs. This is Ghana in 2008. And the black squares indicate the area of the product space where Ghana has a relative advantage. So, for example, it's got quite a lot in the export of natural resources, as we'd expect. The bigger the square, the larger the contribution to world trade of that particular commodity. Now, if you look at Malaysia, the picture in Ghana hasn't really changed since the 1950s, 1960s. There's been some development, but largely it's been driven by aid agencies suggesting that they move upstream towards producing things upstream of raw materials, so getting into chocolate production or various moving upstream from palm oil, but moving too far upstream where they didn't have capabilities. So a lot of the attempts to actually build Ghana's export capability fell away. Malaysia, on the other hand, and what's quite interesting is they both started off with one of the core key commodity in common, which is palm oil. Malaysia built on its palm oil productivity, it expanded into chemicals, it expanded into electronics, it expanded a whole range of different phenomena by essentially using the Chinese methodology. You need to cross the river one step at a time and build on what you've already got. And what's quite interesting is that Ghana remained largely as it did. Malaysia kind of moved beyond that quite significantly. And by paying attention to the network, and I would have brought a video that for you to actually observe. Was slightly concerned about the technological capabilities, but you can actually see how this evolves over time. When you go online, you can compare the two countries and see how that history is unfolded, and you can actually see specifically the points at which industrial development was triggered and took off in Malaysia. So I think what's really interesting is that the Atlas brings an analytical rigor to the complex dynamic nature of economic growth, which really remains quite opaque using standard development tools and techniques. And it gives us the ability to answer long-standing questions in much more precise ways. So one of the developers summed it up for me, said that the standard approaches to development economics uses measures that were developed in the 1930s and 40s for the kinds of problems and the kinds of crises that we're facing back then. And he's called for a new breed of measures that has much more precision and resolution, and then we don't continue to base our analysis on the oversimplification of a complex system. And they've done quite well. This measure that they've got is the Index of Economic Complexity, and it's proved incredibly powerful in predicting growth. In fact, The Economist magazine described it as 10 times more effective than the existing measures that we have for predicting growth, including the World Bank techniques, tools for good governance, and the World Economic Forum competitiveness indices. So it's a really powerful tool, and I think it's really good example of how complex systems thinking can be used in very practical ways. And it's being used to facilitate dialogue, it's being used to think about trade across countries. There's been quite a lot of research on looking at agricultural development in different parts of Africa, particularly in the East African region, looking at exactly these tools and techniques. So I think the key to this study and all the others is how their proponents, how their champions used these ideas to challenge their existing assumptions, to challenge their existing expertise, and to bring solid, rigorous, data-driven approaches which could transform our understanding of these problems and thereby help displace these long-held and inappropriate assumptions. And I think these ideas help because they bring, as I said, ways of thinking about systems, behaviours and relationships and dynamics which are much more relevant, that they help us understand the full diversity of problems that we face, and they provide us with useful lenses and tools to grasp these problems more fully. And just to give you a quick summary, this is kind of broadly speaking the kinds of sciences of simplicity, which I would argue still very much underpin much of aid, and the science of complexity and what they bring. I think what's quite important is that the science of complexity aren't the only way to bust these assumptions. They're not the only way to move to a more realistic view of development problems. But as many heterodox social scientists, anthropologists, for example, are used to dealing with behaviours, or psychologists may well want to tell us a lot about the kind of economics team would tell us a lot about how behavioural economics can bring new ways of thinking. What's interesting, though, is that you have a lot of these alternative assumptions bolted onto an otherwise standard model. So you bring in a little bit of behaviours here or a little bit of dynamics there. But what complexity brings is the ability to transform these assumptions, to challenge these assumptions comprehensively. So it enables us to develop a view of the world that has much greater fidelity to the world. And as a result, it can help inform our policy and practice and make it much more relevant and much more appropriate. I think where we need to be careful is not to turn it into a panacea on the one hand. It's going to be the solution to all development problems. We still need to be able to apply the science of simplicity where they're relevant. And also we need to be careful, and this is something that development agencies are very good at, is to use a new intellectual justification for long-standing pet projects. So the world is complex, therefore do the thing that I've been banging on about for years. So we need to kind of avoid both those things. I think the key is, it's not about saying everything is complex, it's about being much more scientific about development and saying we need to deal with complex problems appropriately, and when we're dealing with simple problems, deal with them as well as we can. So let me quickly close with a couple of reflections that the world that we live in today is not what we expected to be living in 10 or even 20 or 30 years ago. It's characterized by uncertainty, unpredictability. And in the face of these kind of new vulnerabilities, we need new ways of thinking, new ways of addressing the problems that we face if we're going to navigate the turbulence that we face. And I think what's becoming very clear is we can't solve some of the problems like climate change, like global health, like conflict by using the mindsets, using the tools that we've inherited. I think the world that we live in makes understanding and navigating complexity ever more essential. And if we want development to be more realistic, more relevant, more appropriate, if we want to make more of a difference in the lives of those around us, I would argue that complexity thinking is a really important approach to follow. So let me return briefly to the smallpox case. And this is my favourite story about the campaign, apart from the one about how it was actually achieved. Many of the heads of WHO were very sceptical that the eradication would work. And the most senior official in India said that if they were successful, he would eat the tyre from his 4x4. What was quite interesting was after the campaign ended, Don Henderson, who I quoted earlier, sent the gentleman in question a tyre with some kind of encouraging note. History doesn't actually reveal what happened to the tyre, but I'd like to think that the gentleman in question was a man of his word, and I'd like to think that he actually perhaps sat down and actually decided to have a chew through this tyre. And perhaps while he did so, he reflected on the need to change his way of thinking and maybe challenge his assumptions. I think there's maybe even be an analogy in there for AIDS mechanical addiction I described earlier. It's quite a nice image, and it's one I'm going to close with. Thank you for listening.